I first discovered Mastodon through the Blood and Thunder and Sea Beast singles way back in high school, like 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. And it's pretty wild that, like, even today I can put on one of their albums that I must have spun 100 times and discover something that I just haven't heard before about it. Anyway, I'm gushing and I've barely started the video, but these guys have sort of surreptitiously wormed their way into being one of my favourite metal bands. One of my favourite bands, honestly, over the many years that I've been dipping in and out of their discography. And while I'm not intimately familiar with everything in it, there's definitely some early stuff and some more recent stuff that I haven't invested a huge amount of time into. I really just wanted to take some time to sing their praises for a bit, so that's why we're here. Obviously I'll be critical as ever. If something rubs me the wrong way, then I will not be afraid to call that out, and I will be rating these albums on a scale from S to D, as shown here. If you want a full breakdown of exactly what I mean by each of those tiers, go look at my Arcade Fire video. I went into it in a lot more depth there, but suffice to say, D is something I will probably never listen to again, and S is something which I worship. So I'm sure you can work out what the scales between that are. Anyway, I'm inevitably going to waste enough time rambling about this band, so let's just get on with it, shall we? Let's just get on with it. Okay, so already we're looking at a record with a big old asterisk next to it. It's technically a compilation that was released in 2006, I believe, of the band's first two EPs, which themselves contained tracks from the original 2000 demo, re-recorded without their original vocalist. So for the sake of witnessing the evolution of the band, I figured it was best to just start here, especially considering the band themselves have gone on record on multiple occasions referring to this as their first album. That out the way, I find this one to be a bit of a mixed bag. The first half of the record especially, I don't know if it necessarily does it for me. This was obviously a time before they found their signature balance of the more aggressive, raw elements of sludge metal and the more polished intricacies of prog rock. And at this point it feels like an overly clean, overly detailed version of something which tends to work better as a more visceral, straightforward gut punch. Of the first 5 tracks, 4 of these fit that mould, and they're not bad tracks by any measure. I mean, these are fairly well written songs featuring some really tight musicianship, particularly the drumming. Like, if you're a drummer and you want to feel inferior, just listen to this album. Brandale is a beast at the best of times, but the sort of thing he's doing on like Welcoming War, where he's laying down these really intense, like fill-laden machine gun blast beats throughout the entire song, it's like being able to do that is just an impressive feat in and of itself. And there are some really nice riffs, some tight little mathy segments. They're not bad tracks, but if I want something with this sort of level of abrasiveness and aggression in this particular style, then I'm going to be leaning more towards the sort of thing Iron Monkey or I Hate God were doing, right? I do quite like the remaining track in the first 5, We Built This Come Death, which is I think the only instance on the entire record that uses anything even remotely approaching clean vocals, and it contrasts these slightly quieter, slightly more down-tempo sections with this absolutely sort of rip-roaring, jagged, almost industrial-sounding riff. It's a bit of a yo-yo of a song, but it works quite nicely. The back half definitely sees the band approaching a sound more akin to what they would go on to define as their signature style, especially for the following 2 or 3 albums. I don't think they always hit the mark with these. Call of the Mastodon has a sort of nice signature riff, but doesn't really sort of do much with it and does just sort of end kind of abruptly. And Deep Sea Creature doesn't really have a great deal in it that particularly stands out to me. Honestly, I prefer some of the earlier tracks on here to this one, just because it's just sort of there in the track list. Battle at Sea is pretty cool though. It sort of lays the blueprint almost for what a lot of modern doom bands are doing these days. It's got this really sort of slow, pondering, ominous sounding riff and these proper like deep low register growls really just conjure the image of something like rising up from the depths, you know. And I really do love the little drum roll fills that come in sort of around the halfway mark of the track, just sort of adding impetus and almost like cascading like the ocean itself. It really does paint a picture, this song. Slick Leg is also just great. It's just a riff showcase. It can feel a little bit disjointed at times, but it is just really like as catchy as this style of music can possibly be, really high energy, and just the constant like tempo switch ups in it just constantly keep you on your toes and make you pay attention, you know. So all things considered, not a bad first showing. I definitely do come back to this record from time to time and go, oh yeah, these guys actually went hard in their early days. But I don't think they'd really quite honed their signature sound. They hadn't really reached their potential on this record. There's a lot of ideas that feel a little bit half-baked, or don't really gel their range of influences together particularly well. I think I'll call this one a C, but it does have some really cool distinctive highlights on it. So the bulk of Remission feels like a natural continuation of what they were doing on the earlier EPs, right? It's a lot of the same sort of hardcore influenced, rapid fire, hyper aggressive, intricate riffing. Like, it's stylistically very similar, but it feels like the songwriting has taken a noticeable step up from what we were listening to previously. And they've developed a method of more seamlessly weaving in some of their more sort of heady, prog rocky influences. There's 3 tracks on here that are well over 6 minutes long, considerably bigger than anything we saw on the previous record, and all 3 of them are pretty decent, honestly. Trilobite's probably my favourite. That one feels like it could quite comfortably sit on like Crack the Sky or one of their other more proggier albums. Some really neat, understated guitar passages. It still has the ferocity in there at moments, but there's something a lot more spacious and breathable about it. I do really like the descending bass notes that sort of underpin the main riff that runs throughout the second half of the song. There's a lot of sort of contrasting elements between the guitars, which is something they do on a lot of songs, honestly. It seems to be a common theme. Like Mother Puncher, which is like another riff showcase similar to Slick Leg on the previous record, has both guitarists playing almost identical riffs, but one of them will just play like the odd note differently, and it like sort of makes the guitars harmonise together in a really nice way. They also use this quite well on Trampled Under Hoof as well. A track which isn't necessarily my favourite on the album, but that one main riff, it really works as a result of this. The other longer tracks are not quite as strong as Trilobite, I don't think. I do really like the second half of Ole Nessie. Some really powerful chord progressions on there. I really like the ponderous riff that underpins the vocal deliveries on the second half of the song, but the first half of the song, I don't know if it's the mixing or something. There's like this really sort of underwhelming, not particularly compelling guitar lead, which just repeats for like a solid 2.5-3 minutes. And there's some really cool like drum soloing going on behind that, but it's not like brought out of the mix enough, I don't think. It's like we're focusing on the wrong stuff. And the longest track, Trainwreck, I do like, honestly. It builds to a really satisfying climax at the end, but it's like 7 minutes long, and there's essentially one major riff which we're just hearing over and over again, and it does sort of, I see what they're going for, but it's not hitting quite as well as perhaps it could. A lot of the shorter, harder tracks here are really good though, to be fair. I really like Crusher Destroyer, the opener. This is probably like the least developed song on here, but it's just ferocious. It's a really cool way of opening an album, just sort of slaps you around the face, says forget whatever you were doing previously, you're listening to this now, pay attention, you know. Workhorse is a personal favourite. The almost like taunting guitar riff that plays a few times throughout this song is really neat, and honestly the vocals, I honestly can never remember who's who when it comes to vocals. They basically all sing in this band, but whoever's doing the vocals on here is just like got this unhinged ferocity about it. He's just going at it. You can practically feel the spittle, you know. It's great. And I like March of the Fire Ants quite a bit as well. It manages to move through a few different interesting movements. I really like the guitar lead section where like the two guitars are sort of intertwining and playing against each other almost, and it almost conjures images of, you know, marching fire ants. You can feel them skittering, you know. It's like a powerful auditory image. There's a couple tracks on here that don't do quite so much for me though. Where Strides the Behemoth is one in particular that I don't really get much out of. The riffs all feel a bit muddled. I don't know if it's like overcompressed mixing or something, but it feels like it's too much almost. A lot of these tracks are very full on, but this one just is like a brick wall of sound, and I can't be doing with it. Burning Man is the epitome of there too, honestly. It's just another one of these sort of more high octane sludgy numbers that I don't know if the album benefits much from having it on there. And then Elephant Man is a weird closer. I don't hate it, but it just feels really like tonally inconsistent with the rest of the album. Like it's all like these super clean guitars, these bluesy riffs, almost like arena rocky solos. Like again, I don't hate the song, but if you told me it was a Led Zeppelin cover, I'd believe you, you know? Like it just sounds off when stacked up against the other tracks on this record. So yeah, I like this one quite a bit more than Call of the Mastodon. Some really strong highlights on here. I think we're looking at the upper end of B tier for this. Okay, fuck it, I think I'm familiar enough with this record that I can pretty much structure this mini review as like a worst to best list, okay? So for me, worst on this record is Island. Essentially, this one feels like a bit of a holdover from the previous records. It's some more of that sort of hyper-aggressive, hardcore, sludgy stuff. Really like muddy, noisy riffs that generally don't really do much for me. I think here there is a little bit more of an ear for hooks than there has been on their previous work. I do like the little guitar squeals that surface amongst the noise every now and then. And I do think this song serves a pretty good purpose of breaking up the album a bit, adding a bit more of that sort of intensity into a sort of run of slightly cleaner tracks. But yeah, it's the only one here that I probably wouldn't miss if it was missing off the record. For number 9, it's I Am Ahab. There are some okay riffs on here. I do really like that one that goes. I like that when that sort of trades off with the vocals. I think that's a pretty cool effect, but it doesn't quite hold up to some of the better moments on this record. For 8, I think we'll go Joseph Merrick. This one's like a 3-minute instrumental palate cleanser at the end of the record, but unlike its namesake on the previous record, I think this one manages to elicit a more somber, intimate tone without feeling completely out of sorts with the rest of the record. I think it must be something to do with like the sort of sonar-style reverb on the guitars and just sort of the sort of thickness of the production. It's really pretty, but it doesn't really feel like it detracts from the rest of the record in any way. Number 7, I think, is probably Megalodon. I actually really do like this song. It's got some really cool, probably some of the strongest sort of technical guitar pieces in it. Some really nice sort of back and forth between the guitars on it. But the vocals do feel a little bit dry on this one, and there is a sort of schizophrenia to it. Some of these pieces don't feel like they gel together quite as well as they should. There isn't as much of a sort of through line as there could be in the song. I am nitpicking though, like I basically love every song from this one up. We'll put Naked Burn at 6. The like jagged guitar harmonizing at the start is a really cool effect. And this song also has some of the like cleanest, most memorable vocal melodies on the entire album. 5, and it pains me to put this song so low because it's fucking great, is Aqua Dementia. Probably the only track here that can stand up to Megalodon as far as guitar intricacy is concerned, some really neat noodly bits. They also bring Neurosis' Scott Kelly in to provide guest vocals on this song, and his like raspy delivery adds like an entirely new facet to the music. Works really well on a more aggressive tune like this. Also, the colossal climax to this song is just amazing, and God Will Watch It Burn bellow that comes out towards the end of this thing, accompanied with this monumental riff. It's so good. The top 4 should be obvious because they have been highlighted as my picks, but the 4th of the 4 is Hearts Alive. Still the longest track in their discography, I believe. This is truly a prog rock epic. Super dynamic. Goes from like intense battering to much cleaner, more serene moments. It feels like being on a ship in a storm, which is probably exactly what they were going for. The only reason I'm putting this below the top 3 is because it is quite a time investment to listen to the whole thing. And there is a still very cool, like, noodly mathy passage that comes in about 7:30ish, which does feel like it derails the flow of the song a little bit, but I mean, it's still really cool to listen to, so who cares, right? Picking between the top 3 is like picking between children. Like, I shouldn't have to do this, but I'm doing it to myself anyway. I think number 3 has to be Sea Beast. This song has one of my favourite guitar riffs of all time, ever. From anyone. Feels like a creature crawling over itself, just the way it sort of lumbers up and down these high register notes. It will just play in my head at random times without prompting. It's crazy. And the vocals are just completely off kilter on this thing, the way they swing up and down, like, it's so distinctive, it really is. However, it is unfortunately not Blood and Thunder, which I guess I'm putting it to. Riffs on riffs on riffs on hooks, like, it's no surprise that this was the song that sort of made the band. So many colossal moments, you know, split your lungs with blood and thunder, you know, like, such a strong opener and sets the tone just perfectly for the rest of the album, it really does. And that just leaves Iron Tusk for my number 1, I guess. Absolute spectacle of a drum line on this thing. These really, like, densely layered, sparse guitar riffs that somehow manage to elicit so much energy despite the minimalist notes played, and just sort of the violent spitting delivery of the vocals. Goddamn, this song just magnetically attracts my fist to the air. I can't help it. So yeah, I really like this album. You may have guessed that. You may have got that from what I've just rambled on about for the last God knows how many minutes. Yeah, this one's an S, and there'll be no further questions. Blood Mountain's a little bit of a weird one for me because I basically really do enjoy every track on here, but it just doesn't quite deliver anything quite as much of a spectacle as what Leviathan had on it, right? Like at its worst, it hits a bit of a lull around the 2/3 mark. Hunters of the Sky and Hand of Stone are probably the two weakest tracks on here. And while the former has a pretty dramatic intro and the latter is carried by a pretty nifty little riff, both of them do tend to meander a little bit. But outside of that, there's some pretty great material on here. The Wolf is Loose is such a ferocious opener. This is basically the closest the band have ever come to making thrash metal. Absolutely belts along at breakneck pace, cascading through a series of different riffs and vocal melodies and just absolutely doggedly refusing to let up for even a second. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, you got a song like Sleeping Giant, which is much more lumbering, much more methodical. It seems like the third track on a Mastodon album is reserved for a track like this. It reminds me a lot of Sea Beast, especially in the high register little lead guitar lick that plays throughout it. It's got that same sort of skittering quality that Sea Beast's had. Capillarian Crest is insane, just intense math rock noodling throughout, quite possibly the most complex and tight thing they've ever released from a guitar perspective at least. Colony of Birchmen is one of the songs that got me into the band in the first place. Even though I'll never unhear Josh Homme on the background vocals, it has such a driving, bellowing impetus and again, a very cool riff. I say that a lot about this band, but they write some good riffs, what can I say? Speaking of unexpected cameos as well, Cedric Bixler-Zavala from At the Drive-In and Mars Volta appears on Siberian Divide, providing these like high-pitched laborious moans in the instrumental passages, which contrasts so intensely with these massive bellowing vocals that take place throughout the rest of the album. Pendulous Skin honestly does everything that the Elephant Man did off Remission, which is to say it falls into a lot of more conventional hard rocky tropes which don't necessarily gel super well, but honestly there's a lot of like intricacy and intrigue to the song. It has this really floaty production. I like it a lot as a way to close off this particular chapter. And there's just a bunch of neat little moments dotted throughout the record as well, like the absolute shred fest that is the Crystal Skull solo, or the weird distorted vocals at the end of Circle of the Sisquatch, or whatever the Hellblade Catcher's doing. It's just a trip of a song. So I could never call this album bad by any means, but I don't know, as a package it feels a lot cleaner, a lot crisper, a lot less dense and consuming than Leviathan did. And as much as I enjoy a lot of these little ideas and elements and the more sort of experimental, creative ideas that they brought to the table here, there's nothing that measures up to like the end of Aqua Dementia or that massive coda on Hearts Alive. You know, there's no colossal Mastodon moments on this record. So yeah, very, very good. This is A tier for sure. It just doesn't quite scrape into S, unfortunately. You know what, I think I'm going to get into the habit of doing worst to best track ordering for albums that I both really like and have a relatively concise track list like this one, so let's do that again this time. So worst on this album for me is undeniably The Last Baron. Don't get me wrong, I really do enjoy basically every segment of this track. The hazy, heady main verses, the more sort of rapid-paced, riff-laden mid-sections, heavy vocal layers on the cries of "Will he save me?", the immense extended rip-roaring solo at the end. It's a great track, it really is. My biggest problem with it though is that it's the second longest track in the band's discography at about 13 minutes long, and I don't think it justifies that length. Hearts Alive was constantly evolving, moving through different movements and everything. This track feels like after it hits the huge climax at about 8 minutes, it could just move towards the ending, but then there's another 4 minutes of just sort of repeating itself, maybe like upping the ante slightly, adding in some extra backing vocals or an extra guitar lick here and there, but it is just regurgitating what we've already heard earlier on the song, and it just doesn't feel necessary. So very cool components, but weakest track on the album. Next worst is weakest of a good bunch, Divinations. I love that like banjo sounding opening, the sort of intricate picking that plays throughout the song. I like how the verses trade off between cleaner vocals and then rawer shouted vocals. It like adds a real dynamic element to it. And the choruses are pretty jubilant and everything. I think the only thing that makes this a little bit weaker than the other tracks for me is that it does just sort of end a little bit abruptly, and some of the vocal melodies aren't quite as gripping as they are elsewhere on the album. Still a cool track though. Fifth best is the one immediately following, Divinations, Quintessence. I really do love the jagged riff in the verses and the absolutely insane like drum fills that just lace honestly most of the track, but the verses in particular. And again, a really strong chorus on this one, particularly following the sort of pre-chorus like back and forth of the two vocalists screaming letting go at each other. Having this like quite clean, quite boisterous chorus following that makes it all into like a neat little package, I think. And now we're getting into the real heavy hitters of the album. I think fourth best is probably Ghost of Corellia. This has another one of those snaky, like high neck lick riffs, which I really do enjoy. I like the way it sort of descends down a scale sort of thing. And then while the verse vocals don't exactly mirror that melody, it is cool that they also like descend in pitch, almost to like mirror what the guitar's doing. And then just the general impetus of the big riff that comes in a little further into the track. The bellowing vocals that between heaven and earth gets me every time. I don't know why that line particularly, but it hits properly hard. Which leaves us with just the top three. And while the previous three songs were all really good in their own right, I think these top three are all easily among the top 10 Mastodon tracks, full stop, as far as I'm concerned. Pretty flawless start to finish. I think probably 3 will be Oblivion, which I might have to call the strongest opener they've ever had, which is crazy considering it's up against Blood and Thunder and The Wolf is Loose, but here we are. Just that colossal, mounting, like chime of a bell of a riff that leads in the album. This also probably has some of the strongest vocal melodies in their career, maybe? And closes with such like a pure, clean guitar solo that it sounds like something David Gilmour could have written. But there's so much intentionality behind every note in it. Like, these guys are obviously insanely technically talented musicians. There's a lot of mathy stuff going on in their records, but it's pretty rare that you hear them play something with this much like soul and feel to it, you know? And it's absolutely glorious when it happens. Number 2, we're going with The Tsar. This used to be my favourite track by them, honestly. Now I do think it suffers a little bit from Last Baron syndrome. I think they repeat the first verse like immediately again, and then a third time at the end of the song, and I think the first and third ones are great. The second one could maybe have been trimmed, potentially. But having said that, I do just love everything this song does, so I'm kind of okay with it. Absolutely like haunting guitar tone at the start of the song, and the hypnotic mantra of don't stay, run away. And perhaps most importantly, the monumental climax to this song. After like a short ambient section, it just bombards into the room with this huge spiraling up through the crack in the sky. The guitar's doing this din 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 thing. It's such great counterpoint. The majesty of the whole thing is just mind-blowing, it really is. So yeah, it could easily have been the best song on the album if it weren't for the fact that my favourite Mastodon song, Full Stop, is on here too. Crack the Sky is just gorgeous, it really is. The huge weight of the pendulum swing riffs, the gorgeously clean arpeggios that run over the top of it. Scott Kelly returning again to add some like real depth and raw intensity to the mix, especially on a record where a lot of the rest of the band's vocals are leaning in a more clean direction. The hook of I can see the pain, it's written all over your face, which hits hard regardless, but when you know the context of the song being an ode to drummer Brandela's sister who committed suicide, like, it's such an absolute gut punch. And I'm not really in the habit of just reading out sections of lyrics, but again, the final verse on here, Mama, don't let them take her down, at least alone. Please tell Lucifer he can't have this one, her spirit's too strong. Like, in context, it's just wow, you know. Anyway, yeah, I suppose I should give the whole album a rating. It's an S, isn't it? It's an S. Trying to decide between this and Leviathan as my favourite record is difficult, but I think this one probably does just scrape it, just about. Well done, Crack the Sky. Okay, so I just spent well over 5 minutes harping on about how great Crack the Sky is, so I'm going to try and make this one as short and sweet as possible. I covered the Her OST for Arcade Fire, so I figured it was only fair if I covered the OST work for Mastodon as well, and this one is not good. Feels like the band were really roped into sort of making something in their sort of heavier, iconic style when, from a creative perspective, they were really trying to head more towards the more concise, cleaner prog rocky stuff that we're going to be seeing a lot on The Hunter in a second. So these ideas just really do just feel incredibly half-baked. I mean, again, in context of the movie, which I've seen, and it sucks, these tracks are probably the highlight, but just as a sit-down, listen-to experience, there's not really much to get excited about here. The highlight's probably Clayton Boys, sort of their take on, I guess, a spaghetti western sort of vibe, but take those sort of slinky guitar riffs and like add that Mastodon meat to them, and it's got a lot of its own character, I'll grant you. But picking another highlight beyond that was just not going to happen. Deathmarch has a cool riff, but then it's repeated for 9 minutes without really going anywhere. I guess there's a half-decent guitar solo, over the top of it, but there's not really anything to sink your teeth into here. Indian theme sounds like a half-baked cast-off from the Blood Mountain era, just with the vocals stripped out. And Train of Thought, I guess, builds to a decent minute and a half at the end of it, but everything up until then is just massively underwhelming. And then of course we're finishing off with just two slightly alternate takes on Death March and Clayton Boys again, which, like, I didn't like them the first time round, I don't particularly want to hear them again the second time. So yeah, we'll pretty much end this here. This is a D tier, and I hope they honestly get a chance to score another movie at some point and get to do a better job than this. I distinctly remember running defense for Mastodon when this album came out in 2011. The Hunter is very different to what they'd done previously, taking a considerable step towards a more poppy, accessible sound. And at the time I was all for a band doing what they wanted to do and trying to evolve their sound rather than repeating what they'd done previously ad nauseum just to try and appease the hardcore fans, right? So I was actually quite intrigued to go back to it after all these years and see if it holds up the way I thought it did. And honestly, the answer is sort of. It's definitely an album of two parts, so intensely front-loaded it's almost unfair. Black Tongue and Curl of the Bill get the album started on like a infectious riffing hard rock high energy note. The former could honestly be a track off Blood Mountain. It has a lot of the same energy as tracks like Colony of Birchmen, a sort of denseness of production, but still a cleanness and immediacy of its ideas. Curl of the Bill, meanwhile, has a much sort of sparser, meatier guitar tone. I'm not mad about the chorus vocals, but the riff that goes along with it, the digga-ding-ding-ding, digga-digga-digga-ding-ding-ding, is just pretty cool, honestly. And then get into a couple of my favourite tracks on the album. Blasteroid is so unlike anything they've done before. Just high octane, high paced, like mile-a-minute stuff. I really do enjoy the sheer velocity of this track. And it brings in one of the only instances of harsh vocals on the entire album for the chorus, which are honestly some of my favourite examples of this in their discography. Just the rabid ferocity of that vocal performance is just great. Stargasm then follows it up with just like gorgeous prog rock stuff. The first minute of this song alone is enough to keep this album far away from D tier, and the choruses on this song are just pretty immense. Octopus Has No Friends puts us in like a familiar realm with some sort of mathier riffing, and the hugeness of the choruses, they are distinctively Mastodon if just wrapped up in a cleaner, more vibrant package, right? Speaking of big choruses, all the heavy lifting has one of my favourite ones on the album. The rest of the song I can take or leave, but that iconic refrain of just close your eyes and pretend that everything's fine, it's beautiful, it really is. And then the first half closes off with The Hunter, which is this like sparse, reverby, intimate track, really. Simple to the point lyrics and super clean guitar work, and it's a little bit maudlin, but it's really pretty. It's such a vibe of a song. After that though, the album really does fall off. Drybone Valley feels like a reject from one of the less good Queens of the Stone Age albums. Just this sort of swaggering desert rock style, but without any of the crisp hooks that you normally get from Josh Homme and co. Thickening just feels like stitched together out of random ideas. The intro, the chorus, and the verse just all sound like completely different songs, and it just doesn't flow well at all. Creature Lives has some good ideas. Honestly, it sounds like it's taking a page from fellow prog sludge band Baroness's book, with these big harmonised hymnal style vocals, but it just doesn't really do anything with the concept. It just meanders a bit. I mean, Steel That Sleeps the Eye, this ain't. And then Spectre Light, it just feels like a token. We need to have a heavier song in the album at this moment. They bring back Scott Kelly once again for this, but even he can't seem to pull this track out of a remarkable mediocrity. The final two tracks do pick up a little bit. I do quite like Bedazzled Fingernails, with its like clockwork riffing and its really distinctive vocal deliveries. It's an interesting track, not anything to get too excited about, but it feels like a breath of fresh air after the previous few, honestly. And then The Sparrow is a functional closer. It does the trick. It returns to a lot of what they were doing on The Hunter. It feels a little bit unnecessary as a result of that, like we've already had the sort of quiet, reflective, spacious piece, and now we've got another one, but it's pretty enough and a fairly enjoyable listen, right? But it just doesn't grip me like the other song does, and for some reason it feels the need to try and build up into this like big climax towards the end, but it's pretty unremarkable, and I think the track would have been better off without it. So yeah, there's some good stuff on The Hunter, there is, but the fact that most of the best moments on here are just stuff that harkens back to their better albums doesn't really do it any great favours, I don't think. I appreciate that they were experimenting, but I think this one has to go in C tier. Hunter was the band sort of scrabbling around, experimenting, trying to find a new sound for themselves. Then Once More Around the Sun is the point where they sort of laser focused in on that and really made an effort to put out a set of aesthetically similar but far tighter and more memorable bangers, right? There's clearly like a chorus out approach to the songwriting here. Basically every track on here has a really strong hook of a chorus, and it really comes down to how well the surrounding elements elevate that chorus, whether the song is a hit in my eyes or a little bit of a miss. And I say miss, but honestly, like, the worst moments on here are still a step up from the weaker elements on the Hunter, right? Like, we might as well cover the weaker points first. I think the Motherlode track 2 doesn't do a great deal to ingratiate itself to me outside of its fairly catchy chorus, and I really don't like the guitar solo on this thing. It like interrupts a fairly engrossing, groovy instrumental section to just like needlessly wank a little bit and just sort of derail the song in my eyes. I think Feast Your Eyes is a bit of a nothing burger, honestly. Basically all I remember about the song is that it has good drumming, but it's a Mastodon song, don't they all? And the closer, Diamond in the Witch House, starts strong, sets up a really nice atmosphere, and closes on this like intense drumming section and these booming vocals that make for quite a satisfying climax, but there's like 5 minutes in the middle there that I sort of zone out a little bit. Those tracks aside, I think most of what's on here is pretty good. Tread Lightly is possibly the weakest opener they've had so far, but it doesn't do anything to particularly off-put me in any way. I really like the big sort of soaring guitar parts that open and close Chimes at Midnight, and I think the bulk of the song that's bookmarked by this is pretty groovy, has a pretty nice riff to it. It sort of puts me in mind of Stargasm off the previous album, which I really liked. And then that track's immediately followed by Sleep in the Deep, which is possibly my favourite on here. Honestly feels like it could sit on Crack the Sky. It's like a pretty satisfying marriage of the tighter, more technical riffing and like this really sort of thick ambience. And I love the chorus that sort of harmonises and trades off two different vocal leads. I really love when music is able to do that. High Road is probably the strongest of the sort of more immediate catchy tracks. Pretty strong performances all over. I really like both the main riff, which has this really like meaty, hefty texture to it, and then the chorus riff, which like traces the vocal melody, just like syncopated slightly so that it produces this really sort of satisfying echoey effect. Ember City is also really strong from this sort of perspective. Just front to back, strong guitar work. I love the big vocal hook of "What do I say to you?" It's sort of indicative of the fact that this album is a lot cleaner than their earlier work, more focused on these sort of earworms, but it does a pretty good job of it. And then Aunt Lisa's just a pretty cool track all round. Like, it's relatively short, but it goes through quite a few different movements, really tight, like mathy guitars, shifting time signatures all over the place, and the group vocals of "Hey Ho, Let's Fucking Go" at the end. Like, it's a bit silly, but I feel like it works in the context of this more high energy track. So yeah, this is probably the most radio friendly thing they've done so far, lacking a lot of the sort of weirder out there aspects that the Hunter had, really just serving up a plate of fun music, which is not a bad thing. Not everything has to be super serious all the time, right? And while there are a few minor missteps on here, I think it's fair enough to put it in B tier. It's kind of weird really how the Hunter was so intensely front-loaded and then this album is so intensely back-loaded. I genuinely didn't think I'd like this album at all when I first started listening to it. Sultan's Curse is inoffensive, I guess, but incredibly by the numbers Mastodon. Kind of reminded me of Tread Lightly off the previous record. They just seem to be in the habit now of opening with a song that is just fairly unremarkable. Precious Stones with a different guitar tone and vocalist could be a pop punk song, honestly. It feels really weirdly out of place, and that whole energy is sort of driven home by Steam Breather essentially having what I'm pretty certain is a slowed down version of a Sum 41 riff just throughout it. And then while it is very difficult to pick the best Mastodon song, there's so many good options out there, it's very easy to pick the worst because it's Show Yourself. Show Yourself exists and it is the worst. Routine guitar riffs, a relatively obnoxious vocal hook, and a guitar solo that sounds like it was lifted out of a hair metal band from the 80s. Like, I can't stand this song. Thankfully things do start to pick up a bit from track 5 onwards. I think Word to the Wise and Clandestiny are both really fun, high energy tracks, in spite of the latter having this like slightly cheesy, like retro futuristic synth interlude, which I could could see grating on a lot of people. I think it's kind of okay. But for some reason both of them just seem to be mixed a bit weird. I don't know if it's like brick walling in the volume because they're both faster, more intense songs. When it reaches the choruses in both of them, it's quite noticeable that like certain instruments seem to be sort of dropping in and out of the mix, and it's just not that nice to listen to, but they're still fairly decent songs. Ancient Kingdom does a pretty good job of really amping up the sort of epic vibes, the sort of monumental dramatic flair by using these like clangorous bells to punctuate certain moments in the song. And Scorpion Breath is Scott Kelly's customary appearance on the album. It's pretty good, it's fine. Not his strongest, but I do like this song quite a bit more than both Diamond in the Witch House and Spectrelight, which were his previous two appearances, so thumbs up. The best three tracks are far away the remaining ones though. Andromeda almost feels like old school Mastodon. It's like they remembered what they do best and just wrote some really cool, not only huge and majestic, but really flavourful riffs. Like they've got a lot of character, the sort of guitar work that imprints itself on you, you know. Roots Remain is sort of the symbol of the sort of more modern Mastodon, like prog rock piece, you know, your Stargasms, your Chimes at Midnight. It goes through a lot of different movements, has some really cool guitar tones, some pretty cool vocal hooks. It's ticking all the boxes for me, honestly. I like this one quite a lot. And then Jaguar God. Despite it being really out of pocket and really like off kilter for what you expect from these guys, due to not only starting out as like almost a folk piece with these like nice vocal harmonies and really clean guitar work, and then bringing in this like smattering of twinkling keyboard licks. It's like nothing else in their discography, but I really do like it quite a bit, especially how it sort of evolves and ups the intensity throughout, like bringing in like some of the sort of old schooly sludgier elements and then like more hectic moments, and it's a journey of a song. And assuming we're not counting Hearts Alive as a closer, this might actually be the strongest closer in their discography. 3 great songs unfortunately don't make a good album though. I hate to say it, this is my least favourite outside of the Jonah Hex EP. I think we can give it a C just because the highlights are pretty great, but yeah, weakest full length so far I think. I found out recently that 3 of the 4 tracks on the Cold Dark Place EP were actually offcuts from the Once More Around the Sun sessions, and why these tracks were discarded will forever elude me. I do not get it. This EP sees the band producing a lot more sort of clean, prog rockier stuff. I get that doesn't necessarily sit very well with a certain subset of their fan base, but for me at least I feel like these are the tracks that modern Mastodon do the best. This is the sound that they should be focusing in on, if you ask me. Like, I've sung the praises of Stargasm, Chimes at Midnight, Roots Remain on the previous records, and this EP feels like a distilled version of that, right? Open a Northside Star, in particular. It has an almost Pink Floydish feel to it. It's very spacey, very spacious. It's got this steady, unfolding song structure. It's about as pleasant and calming as these guys ever really get, right? And while the high register singing in the first couple of minutes can be a little bit shaky at times, clearly not necessarily in these guys' wheelhouse. If anything, it just adds like character and emotion to the song. If I had to pick a least favourite on here, it would be track 2, Blue Walsh. It does feel a little bit glossy at times, and perhaps runs a minute or so longer than it necessarily needs to, but it still feels like a comfortable sister track to a lot of those on Once More Around the Sun. A really like big arena stomper of a chorus. It's got some really cool like blues riffs in it as well, alongside some of the more typically Mastodon like mathy bits. It's a cool track, but probably the only one on here that I don't like love, right? Toe to Toes is next, and it feels more classically Mastodon than a lot of what they've done in recent years. It is still a lot less quote-unquote brutal than like something on Blood Mountain or Leviathan or Remission, but I don't know, something about the structure of it, the thick molasses-like production, the way the track flows from really neat earwormy riff to really neat earwormy riff and like demands your attention throughout. I think it does a good job of displaying the band's innate long-standing talents while also making something that's a little more approachable and, dare I say, radio-friendly. Finally, Cold Dark Place comes along and just immediately takes the title of Best Closer off Jaguar God. It held it for all of about 6 months, well done. This track is gorgeous, honestly. It's beautiful. Like, it's got real like Americana folk vibes to it. All these really clean acoustic guitars. There's a steel slide guitar on here, like it has that sort of southern twang about it. But it buoys that on like these like ponderous Mastodon rhythms, these really heady vocal performances. There's some like background ooze on here that do a genuinely really clean job of falsetto, which makes me think the imperfections on Northside Star were perhaps intentional. And while this style persists for like 5 minutes, it's just constantly like emotively captivating and genuinely pretty in a slightly unsettlingly dark way. I feel like there's a lot of inspiration from Sludge Legend's Acid Bath on here. They also did a lot of like folksy stuff from time to time, and I can see a through line there. The track ends with this explosive guitar solo as well, which just sort of turns the structure of the song on its head, and while it is a more sort of conventional quote-unquote rock guitar solo than I would normally enjoy, I think it's a really pretty one and it works really well in context. So yeah, absolute killer song front to back. This EP is just really good all over, frankly. I think maybe Blue Walsh is the only reason I'm not putting this as an S tier. This is top of A. The first thing you notice about Mastodon's latest effort is that it is long. It's a 2-disc extravaganza, something that bands seem to insist on doing again and again and again, despite throughout history most of the time it'd be better off as just a single disc and a little bit of quality control. I mean, for example, if the track list looked like this could potentially be an A tier, maybe even an S tier album. However, it doesn't. It doesn't look anything like that, does it? As I found myself sitting down for what is essentially a movie-length album, I just find myself getting bored, honestly. 15 tracks on here, averaging at about 6 minutes long each, and a lot of them just aren't that interesting. Pain with an Anchor is just more by the books. This one might be a single fluff, honestly. Okay, there's occasionally a half decent riff in there, but like that's about all it's really doing. It's not really speaking to me on a level that a lot of Mastodon's best work so competently does. Teardrinker is only not the worst song in their discography because Show Yourself exists, but it's pretty fucking bland and ineffectual. Had It All just sounds so painfully post-grunge. Like, if you told me this was a Creed song, I would believe you. And it's a Mastodon song. How did this happen? And Skeleton of Splendor is an attempt to recapture the sort of more folksy, intimate vibes that they had on the previous EP, which you think would be a good thing. But there's just nothing to grip me on this song. It just comes across as a dirge, especially when played back to back with The Beast, which, while not the worst song on the album, is also very low energy, heavy on the repetition with this big riff that they keep playing throughout it. Like, it's hard not to catch myself tuning out, honestly. Same can be said for Gobblers of Dregs as well, longest track on the album, 8.5 minutes long. You'd think there'll be something in there to really grab my attention, and again, you know, much like with Pain and Anchor, it has some okay moments, but especially when spread so thin over a track this long, it doesn't feel like it's worth including. And the worst thing about it is that there's some really good material on here. Like, The Crux is great. If this had been the opener, it would have really got the album off to a bang. It's got this really high energy chorus. The rhythm section on here is absolutely crushing, pounding. And the middle eighth that sort of comes out of nowhere doesn't necessarily gel super well with the rest of the track, but I'll let it off because it's just quite a pleasant bit of music to listen to. More Than I Can Chew is incredible. It opens with these like haunting, like, I don't know if they're strings or synths, it's hard to tell. It's all really like ethereal and like almost like playing some really ancient recordings on modern equipment. It has like this musty, hazy feel to it, and then it just rips into these huge verses with this really distinctive vocal melody and this neat, tight little riff to back it up. And it's a song that just sort of keeps building upon itself, keeps ramping up the intensity until it erupts into this gorgeous solo with beautiful guitar tone on the back half. It's a really nice track. Peace and Tranquility does a great job of essentially distilling Mastodon's sound down to things they do best, just rip-roaring riffs. They're relatively like technical and mathy, but really catchy at the same time. There's a real like bombastic nature to them, particularly the one that comes in halfway through just after the song cuts out for a second. I think it's just a really tight song that's structured really nicely. Dagger's cool. It does a good job of marrying like almost blast beat style, like rapid paced rampaging percussion with a actually more downbeat, like prog rockier song. And then when it brings in these like Middle Eastern elements, it's got a much more varied palette than you normally hear in a Mastodon song, and I appreciate it for that. It's nice to hear them sort of pushing beyond their regular boundaries a bit. Eyes of Serpents is just quite majestic. It's a song that soars, you know, it has these like nice little piano pieces in the back that help it create like this more refined sounding, almost elegance, despite the heavier riffing moments that juxtapose against that. The choruses are very poppy, almost a bit too much for my taste, but there's enough going on in this one that it elevates itself well above a track like Had It All. And finally, Gigantium is actually one of my favourite Mastodon songs. Wild that they're still releasing stuff this good, like this late into their career, but you know, hats off to them. It's a song that sort of starts at 10 and then somehow manages to raise the stakes even higher, like the monumental riff that plays throughout the first half of this song and the huge, like, beckoning, echo-drenched vocals. They put so much, like, prestige and importance on the lyrics, right? Which is somehow brought to an even higher level when the song mixes up its formula around halfway through and brings us into this, like, really gorgeous, glossy chord progression and, I don't know, almost like a post-punk sort of thing going on here. It doesn't feel like Mastodon, but it is such a good song, it really is. So yeah, there's some real great highlights on this album, but those highlights are just dragged down by a sea of sort of unremarkable moments. Just an album that stays well beyond its welcome and becomes almost a bit of a chore to listen to at times, so unfortunately I think I'm going to have to go see you for this one as well. And that's the lot, or near enough anyway. Apparently the band are currently working on their 9th studio album, so this entire list will be out of date soon enough, but I didn't know that when I started the video, did I? So here we are. So anyway, after looking at these albums through a more critical lens, I'm pleasantly surprised to find myself maintaining a pretty high level of respect for this band. Most of their albums range from the pretty fucking solid to genuine 10 out of 10 range. And while there is a disappointing amount of records coming in my C tier, it's not for lack of like genuinely amazing tracks. Like all of these records contain moments which have blown me away and I wouldn't be without them, honestly. The quality isn't perhaps quite as consistent as I would like it to be on the more recent records, but that doesn't mean these guys aren't still capable, 25 years into their career nearly, of putting together a piece of music that just really moves me. And as I get older, it seems like there's less and less metal bands that are capable of doing that anymore, particularly while constantly evolving and mutating their sound in the way that Mastodon do. I'm holding out hope for the new album. Hopefully they'll be able to maintain that level of quality without including some of the more fillery tracks like they have done, particularly on the last 2 records, but that all remains to be seen. For now, we will give this discography a pretty solid thumbs up. If you're looking to get into the band, then I can highly recommend Leviathan or Crack the Sky if you're less comfortable with harsh vocals. I also think Once More Around the Sun might be a pretty solid jumping on point for someone coming from the more Queens of the Stone Age-y, Foo Fighters-y sort of realm of music. But honestly, if you're on board with these guys, just give everything a listen. It's pretty much all worth it, Jonah Hex EP notwithstanding. Anyway, I'll call it a day there. Thanks for watching. If you have any suggestions for bands or artists you want me to give a deep dive like this, then fire away in the comments, and I will see you for the next one. Bye.